Welcome to the Real Turf Techs podcast for the technician that wants to get real. Follow along as we talk to industry professionals and address hot topics that we all face. Along the way, we'll learn tips and tricks. I'm your host, Trent Manning. Let's have some fun. Welcome to the Real Turf Techs podcast, episode 120. This episode's going to be a little different. I sat down with Frank Rossi, PhD, Associate Professor at Cornell University, for an episode of Frankly Speaking, where we talk about the importance of effective communication and the professional development opportunities available for young people in our field. We also nerd out on the critical aspects of real theory and bed knife attitude. Hope you enjoy.
Welcome to Frankly Speaking. Trent Manning, I see CTEM. Does that mean Certified Turfgrass Equipment Manager?
Yes. Yep.
After your
I
name?
had to think about that for a minute, but because we usually shorten it to turf instead of turf grass. But yeah.
Okay, so Certified Turf Equipment Manager.
Yes.
And so this is a very good place to start. So in your line of work, the word turf doesn't necessarily have this synthetic connotation.
No, it does not, because we deal with is the natural stuff.
All right, that's right. All right, anyway, welcome to Frankly Speaking, Trent. It's so great that we got a chance to do this. And I'll just start out we're going to get to know you a little bit, but I want to get this disclaimer out of the way. I spent the first, 15 years of my life working in golf course shops, and I'm sure it's the reason my language isn't as good as my mother would have liked it to be even at my age now. So I was raised around a golf course shop, I think much like you were as a kid working there, and all the way to assistant superintendent. And I want to say that my relationships with equipment managers, or as we, sort of colloquially call mechanics, golf course mechanics, wasn't always very good. I would just say, full disclosure, I might not have been the easiest on equipment. I could have been a little bit more careful when I used it. And so as a result, I was often at the brunt end of being sort of scolded, which I certainly deserved, and occasionally would step back while something was thrown. But I'm sure it wasn't thrown necessarily in my direction, Trent. So I just wanted to start out by giving you a perspective on sort of my experience of equipment managers, but how pleased I am to see the professionalism come along so far as it has. Now, I'm going to shut up. You're a lifelong Georgian. Looks like you grew up in the golf business. You said this business found you. You didn't find it. So let's take it from there. How did this business find you?
I'll get into that, but I first want to address what you were talking about. And you are what we call that guy.
That guy.
And that's no offense to the women out there, because it's never women that are that person. So it is a guy. It's always a guy. Yeah. And it's that guy. And we talk about that guy on a daily basis on the WhatsApp group that the Real Turf Techs has.
Well, good.
Yeah, so anyway.
Good, that's good. We're going to get back to that topic in a minute, but tell me a little bit about growing up in this business in Georgia.
Yeah, so I just got lucky, I guess. I don't know. I've really enjoyed my career at the golf course. A good friend of mine in high school, he lived in the same neighborhood as the mechanic that worked at Sutton Down Creek Golf Club, and I was 16 and I needed a job, and they were paying like $2 more an hour than minimum wage. And so all our other friends are making a minimum wage. I said, man, this sounds really good. You get to work outside, you get to work with your hands. And obviously I kind of grew up in a rural part of North Georgia, and I was outside all the time, and I really enjoyed the outdoors. I still do enjoy the outdoors. And
so you got some exposure, but then you went to school at Gwinnett.
Yes. So while I was still working in the shop at the golf course, I started on the crew, raking bunkers, mowing greens, all those things that any crew person would do, and then work my way up to assistant mechanic. And during that time, Gwinnett Tech started a program similar to what they had at Lake City at the time,
Hmm.
and I went there in the evenings after work and completed those that continuing education on reels and
And so
electrical.
there actually was information about real theory, REEL theory.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. A whole
Okay.
class devoted to real
Oh,
theory.
this is so great, especially when you consider that's probably a class more superintendents probably should take as well to understand how reels work. Because I'm not always sure everybody understands exactly how reel mowers function. So it's really fascinating that they're training a whole. I mean, it would seem to me to make sense. This sometimes what separates an exceptional equipment manager from an average equipment manager is their ability to really set the reel. So you've been at the same place your entire career?
No, no. I had
No.
an 8 year hiatus. I left the golf course and I went to work for a company building ball fields, still natural turf. And
Right.
I was kind of the project construction manager, so I did all the laser grading of the entire field, or we would do a lot of infields for local high schools and municipalities. And then
Huh.
I also worked with a company that built golf courses as their mechanic, and that was not a lot of fun.
Okay.
The building a golf course was cool, but working on heavy equipment, not my thing.
Okay. Dozers
Yeah,
and dump
yeah.
trucks and big old tires. Yeah, that's a totally different uh kind of work. So you're on a golf course, you leave for a bunch of years, you look sounds like you get into project management a little bit and also keep your mechanical skills going. What brought you back?
Just opportunity, I guess. I also worked for a Toro distributor as a mobile service tech for a couple years, and I was on the road a lot. I was home almost every night, but my kids were young. I was not getting to, I'd leave before they would get up, and they were in bed when I got home, so I wasn't getting to spend much time with them.
Mm.
And maybe it's interesting or not, when I left here in '02, the mechanic that trained me replaced me. And then
Oh.
he retired in 2010, and I
Hmm.
replaced him.
Okay.
So, our director of agronomy that's been here since 1988, he's had
Ooh.
three mechanics, including me.
And you twice.
Yes, he's had me twice. Yeah,
And that's Courtney Young.
that is Courtney Young,
And so,
CGCS.
yeah, that's right, CTCS. Since we're talking letters after names,
That's right, that's
so
right.
there's lots of ways to go here, but let's start out with the early years in your career, right? Because one of the things that I've really appreciated that's happened, Hector sort of might have got it going at TurfNet years ago. Other people were promoting it. Certainly, the big grant to the GCSA from the Melrose Foundation helped. But early on, did you feel like being a golf course mechanic, was a career that you would sort of expand and stay in? I mean, you did leave, but then you did come back. Did you see the progress of it as a profession from when you were there the first time to when you eventually came back?
No, I would.
No.
Yeah, no, I didn't. I didn't really think that was a career. That was just something I could do, and I enjoyed, and it paid okay. So I'll just keep doing it. And then, yeah,
Okay.
the better opportunity came along to be a project manager. I said, yeah, I'll jump on that. So
Yeah.
I was kind of jumping from one thing to one thing,
Okay.
and I really do like working for Courtney, so it was easier, I guess, to come back here. But honestly, it wasn't until I came back in 2010 that I realized this can really be a career.
Mm.
And it wasn't too long after that the IG SEMA merged with GCSA and made the equipment manager designation, and those things started rolling. And since
Yeah,
then, it's
go
been,
ahead.
it's night and day since then,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
recognition we get.
Yeah, and the opportunities. I mean, I think one of the things that the entire industry is struggling with is, availability and cost and quality of the next generation labor force, right? And
Hmm.
I think equipment managers, I think, are in a really interesting position because wouldn't you say more than anything else? Obviously, the professionalism is there, but the amount of technology and organizing different types of equipment, Trent, I'm thinking, years ago when I was on the course, maybe you had something that was electric somewhere on a piece of equipment, but most of it was all engine and reel and metal work. And I bet you now 2/3 of your work is electrical, and that itself has probably made it a little bit more challenging. But I also think it's an opportunity for young people to use technology in the workplace, maybe where working on the grounds crew doesn't. I wonder what you think about that as career opportunities for people who want to do the line of work you're in using technology.
I definitely think it will help get more younger people that are tech savvy into our industry
Mhm.
because that's definitely where it's going. And a quick story I remember, and this was late 90s, John Deere had came out with a mower and it had a controller on it, an ECM,
Mhm.
electronic control module. And all the salesmen in my area anyway was saying this is not a computer because everybody was scared of computers on machines back then. And that was the first thing out of their mouth. So this is not a computer. It just takes inputs and gives appropriate outputs. So I mean, it's a computer, but it's got a microprocessor in it and all these things, but it is not a computer. I just remember that, and I
And
think
it's in, yeah, go ahead.
I think a lot of people, that are mechanically inclined and come up through before me, 70s, 80s, and early 90s, were pretty intimidated by technology. And, but unfortunately, that's something that we have to do to kind of keep up with where we're at today.
And as it's, I think it's exceptionally well put. And I would say you're getting right at the heart of one of the topics that I started off with, which is stereotyping, right? Superintendents are stereotyped as Carl Spackler, and equipment managers are stereotyped by the guys that I work for throwing stuff at me, for being that guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I think we know now is this has a level of professionalism associated with it, but also probably like superintendents, you probably have found that communication skills are more important than maybe you originally thought. I'm wondering if you couldn't talk a little bit about really the same thing that I think plagues a lot of superintendents is their ability to effectively communicate, important priorities and things, not only to their workforce, but to golfers. I'm wondering about the value of communication from your perspective as a really modern equipment manager.
Yeah, communication is the most important thing, honestly. And
Hmm.
whether it's between you and the superintendent, you and the crew, and it's having that open communication. And if the superintendent comes to me and asks, "What do you think about this?" to get my input, that creates buy in for me. And it's easier for me to get behind what he's doing if I own just a tiny part of that too and I'm giving him my opinion. As far as working with the crew, I do think I was kind of taught the old school way to be the angry mechanic that threw stuff. That's just the way it was back then. But since I have learned, you get a whole lot more from people if you just engage positively with them, and talk to them in the morning, in the evening, not just when they bring you a piece of broken equipment. Because there is a dynamic that gets set up at a lot of golf courses where it's the mechanic against everybody else. And everybody else is going to destroy all of his equipment, and all he's going to do is fix it. And, it's an uncomfortable place to be in when that gets set up.
So thank you for bringing up the relationship with the superintendent, and we'll take a break after this. When you start interacting with superintendents, at least when I was doing some mower research in particular, where we're doing distance behind dead center on a reel, for example, where the bed knife sits, I realized many superintendents would get that glazed over look on their face and really not have any idea what I was talking about when I first started talking about this 20 years ago, as we researched it as a component for, causing basal rot anthracnose problems. When you talk to superintendents, and you do so, I would imagine, in some of your traveling around with your Toro thing, obviously Courtney is your most, comfortable example. But what happens when you're talking to, if you were talking to an equipment manager who's trying to figure out a way to say something to his superintendent, but sort of knows that the superintendent doesn't fully understand it, but the superintendent thinks they understand
Mm.
understand it. So how does an equipment manager navigate something sometimes where you know what you sort of need to have, but you're trying to communicate something that maybe might be hard for the superintendent to get their hands around?
That's a really tough question. Yeah,
That's
I
why
don't.
we have you
Yeah,
here.
yeah, that's right. I don't know the best way to, because I kind of get where you're going, and a lot of superintendents might not be open to learning new things, or they
Mm,
think they already have it figured out, and they don't want to be bothered with some of that stuff. That's,
mhm.
and maybe I'm being stereotypical, but that's some of the things that I have experienced, but it's one of the things that I really like about working with Courtney. He is very knowledgeable about what I do.
Mhm.
And I've heard plenty of superintendents say, I can do what the assistant superintendent does, but I can't do what the equipment manager does. And I think
Right.
that's very true in a lot of places. But here, Courtney could do my job just as good as I could, probably. But it's really nice to have that person to go talk to. So for the superintendents listening, I would encourage them to get more educated on real theory, behind center
Mhm.
distance, all the things that we do, so they can
Yeah.
better understand it. And with that being said, I think it's good. I mean, Courtney's brought me to the side or pulled me over here to, look at this. We're looking at rhizomes. We're looking at stolons,
Mhm.
and I'm not an expert on any of that stuff, but at least I have the basic idea and I understand why we top dress. And I think that's really important for a mechanic to understand.
That's right. Especially, well, understand and learn to accept that that is a way to destroy the fine work you do with the great reel. So Trent, let me take a minute and introduce you again. I'm with Trent Manning, host of the Real Turf Techs podcast. Over 100 episodes. So obviously, with many downloads, 30,000 downloads over just a few years of doing it, Trent, there obviously is a hunger for information there. So let's start with the basic stuff. Um, what are the kinds of basic things that if you were talking to a young person who likes working on a crew but might feel attracted to the equipment area, where would be some of the first things you'd want to learn when, like you went back and learned about electrical stuff and real theory? And I'm assuming there's some understanding that everybody gets the basics of an internal combustion engine and a starter and a pull cord and all that baloney. What kinds of professional development things would you tell young people to start to dip their toes into?
I don't anything you can. Whether
Ah, there you go.
whether it's something official. I don't know of too many official programs anymore. I know Lake City had done away with their thing. I do think there's a few of them out there. I think Ohio State has something going, Ed Nagel, and there's probably
Yeah.
some opportunities out there. But honestly, I think just jumping in and tearing stuff apart and putting it back together. And if you work at a golf course, start bugging the equipment manager there, asking him questions. How does this work? How does that work? Kind of see what he's doing. And
Hmm.
that's usually the way we get you in,
Okay.
because it's really hard to find an assistant technician. And a lot of times we pull from the crew. And that's the people we're pulling are the ones that are asking us questions, or we see them working on their personal vehicle in the parking lot. And we say, well, this person has a little bit of mechanical aptitude. Let's
Uh-huh.
give them a shot. And we have a lot of people in the industry that came from automotive, some from motorcycle industry, some from the aircraft industry.
Mm.
And, mechanics is mechanics. The only thing we do different is the cutting unit and reel theory. So if you're going to learn anything, I would say start there because that's kind of our bread and butter.
Yeah,
And
yeah. So
go ahead.
so I agree, but let me challenge you one more piece here. And where I was leading to was this. I mean, like I said earlier, used to be you'd strain to find something electrical. Now we may be confronting a complete electrification of the fleet, except, the biggest pieces of equipment that, as you just said, you don't want to work on those dump trucks anyway. So what's happening in your area, Trent, to address the potential that electrification is going to bring? I mean, you're going to be basically going from turning wrenches to using pliers and plugging computer, laptops into things. Does that present some unique professional development challenges, that switch in equipment types?
Yeah, and I think that's something as an industry we're going to have to think about and get some continuing education in place. So that'll be something I think we'll be seeing at the trade show and conference is classes like that. We already have some about working with technology and some robotic stuff, some coding things, but it's just going to be more and more and more. And I mean, just for instance, I know how to run a CNC machine and I have a 3D printer, so I'm trying to get my hands kind of wet and or feet
Ah,
wet and all those things just because, G code is pretty standard and I don't know what robotics mowers use, but I'm sure it's something pretty similar to G code
okay.
and which is the same as CNC or 3D printing, and that way we can tell the mower where to go and
Okay.
how long to be over there.
That's right. Okay, so this is very interesting. You really see the equipment manager playing an integral role in the adoption of something like autonomous mowing, for example.
Oh, for sure, and just like John Patterson, he's at Atlanta Athletic Club, and he's went all in on the Husqvarna robotic mowers, and they're mowing their whole short game area with robotic mowers from I think Husqvarna, and
Okay.
he's all in on it, and he's doing the training, he does the setup, he trains the crew on what you do if you run into one, how to stop it, how to move it, those kind of
Mm,
things. And the other thing, I think golfers really enjoy seeing them on the course. I'm not going to get in the debate if, what's better, electric or a
mm,
human out there mowing. But
mm,
appearance wise, I think people say, oh, this is a good idea.
mm. Well, and I also think I've heard from people, Trent, say they really appreciate the quiet. And the technology, we would say, is still really in its infancy stage from my perspective. I don't want, I wasn't expecting to go down the autonomous mowing route, but I did want to get into mowers and reel units in particular because we've been talking about the equipment managers end of this, but again, you're you talk to a lot of equipment managers. You are a traveling sort of service person as well, so you interact with a lot of equipment managers. I have a feeling sometimes that on the superintendent end, um, they can tell you what they want sometimes, like I want it to cut better, or I want it to lower the height, or boy, it doesn't seem like the aftercut is good here. The prism has given us a lot more um, sort of knowledge. And I feel like sometimes people don't understand how real mowers work and sort of what's involved. And speaking of debates, the common debate is, gap or no gap, relief or no relief. So let's start with some simple aspects of the way you approach the relationship between the reel and the bed knife when you feel like a mower is set up right and you're ready to walk away from it and they're going to go cut the greens at Augusta. Tell me what you're looking for in that reel so a superintendent can hear what an expert equipment manager is looking for when that reel's set up to go.
Do you have time for a 2-hour podcast?
I know it's a good question.
No,
So
it
the
is a really.
challenge is how do you give it to me in a sort of elevator speech where I'll give you a few minutes to describe something. Now listen, it's 178 years old since Edwin Budding invented the damn thing. You'd think we'd understand it by now. It's not like it's cutting edge, so to speak, technology. So give it to me straight, Trent, but we don't have 2 hours.
Okay, all right. So this is something I say a good bit. We're still calling it real theory, and I'm not the smartest person in the room, but I learned a theory is not proven. If it's proven, it's a law. So
Okay.
I think even though the reel has been around for a long time, I think a lot of people have been miseducated, and this is something I'm just finding out in the last 3 months. That a lot of people have been miseducated when it comes to bed knife attitude and bed knife angle, and it being more aggressive or not. We're going to be doing a class at conference and show this year just on that because I think a lot of us have been taught wrong. But yeah, so we can get into that more later. But to try to answer your question, I think it does depend on what the manufacturer calls for. So, and here's the reason why. So Toro, they call for light contact, and Toro uses a standard ball bearing to rotate the reel in the housing. John Deere calls for a 2/1000 clearance between reel and bed knife. John Deere uses a tapered roller bearing with a spring. So when the John Deere is spinning with a hydraulic motor, electric motor spinning this reel, that reel's moving up and down more than a Toro reel. And Jacobson's the same way with the tapered roller bearings, unless they've changed recently. I apologize, I hadn't had Jacobson in several years.
Yeah.
But
Nobody does. That's part of the problem.
yeah, no, it is a problem. Yeah, that's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, that's okay.
But so far as clearance and no clearance, that's my opinion on clearance and no clearance. Clarence.
Okay. Okay. So what you're saying is follow the way the equipment manufacturers are recommending doing this because it's aligned with the way they know their piece of equipment operates and will operate most effectively. And so while some might call for it, some space, some don't. And it has to do, I guess I didn't realize this with bearings, but I'm more interested in how we've been miseducated. So I probably have enough information to be dangerous here, but I want to wrap up this middle segment with this question. As the reel diameter shrinks, which, maybe as we spin more, it happens more, I don't know. Backlapping has fallen out of favor. Either way, metal's going to wear down eventually, maybe from sand top dressing or whatever else is happening. And slowly but surely, to keep the angle of attack appropriate for the reel mower to work, where the blade contacts the bed knife, you pull the bed knife back a little bit and change the attitude so that when the reel's coming down, it meets it being at a smaller diameter. Do I have that right, or did I learn that piece wrong? Let's start with sort of what happens naturally, and then we'll talk about the way we can mess around with it.
All right, so it depends on what cutting unit you're talking about, if you have that correct or not. So Toro, when they came out with the DPA cutting unit, they got a patent that the behind center distance would stay consistent. It doesn't say the same, but it says consistent throughout the life of the reel, which it does. And I've tested this, and it moves about 5 thousandths throughout the life of the reel, which I would say that's pretty consistent.
That's pretty consistent.
I mean, that's a human hair and a half.
That's
right?
exactly right.
That's pretty consistent. So and John Deere, they also got this patent on their cutting units on the QA5s. They have an eccentric, a cam that you flip when the reel gets to 4.8, and that reestablishes the bed knife attitude. And as the reel wears, your attitude is getting less with a John Deere when the John Deere rear roller adjusts the height of cut.
Right.
And it also, when you flip that cam, John Deere tells you that you may need to raise your front roller. Because if you
Right.
flip the cam, you don't raise the front roller, you're actually in front of center on your bed knife. And then you have all
That's
these
right.
different bed knives too. You have a standard length bed knife, extended, and now there's a super extended bed knife, which is all going to change how aggressive your cut is because that affects your behind center distance.
I love this stuff. I bet you we've lost half the listeners, but I don't care because we studied this for a while, and to listen to you wax on about this warms my heart. So let me take it one more step, and then we'll take a break. Okay. So as I've learned it, and there's been some articles that have shown it as well, John Deere in particular, let's pick on them. Their bed knife can actually be as far front as almost every other bed knife when they come out of the factory. You can set that John Deere up so that the bed knife will be slightly at or in front of center distance or not very far back. And this has resulted in a significantly lower amount of sand being picked up in like the trial that Nikolai and Sorokin did with Hathaway many years ago. So, are there reasons, without looking at wear of the reel, where a superintendent or you might think it's a good idea to pull the bed knife back from the center distance, alter the angle of attack of the reel on purpose, knowing you won't pick up any sand or anything? Would you do that, make that adjustment if the reel it didn't require it in any way for some particular reason that I might not be thinking of, like maybe you get a better cut? Let me know.
Well, yeah, so, and I think that is true, and we were taught correctly about that, that the greater the behind center distance, the better the cut is, but it could lead to a worse aftercut appearance, and it can lead to more scalping. Just me being in the South, we overseed our fairways with ryegrass. I like to have a really aggressive bed knife attitude angle on ryegrass because it's so soft and it lays over so easy. On Bermuda in the spring, I run a pretty aggressive attitude when it's first coming out of dormancy. And then by mid July, I'm pretty flat on my attitude.
Okay. I'm with Trent Manning, certified turf equipment manager at Sitting Down Creek in Georgia. And we just did a little bit of a deep dive. We're going to come up from air after this message.
What I love about Task Tracker is they're constantly innovating and listening to their users. They've added dozens of updates to make our job easier. One new feature is the ability to upload manuals to the equipment. All you have to do is scan the equipment QR code and you have the manual and all other information at the tip of your fingers. You can even create links to those manuals in the work orders, and it goes directly to the page that you need. Make your life a lot easier and check them out at asbtasktracker.com. Let's get back to the episode.
First, wrapping up the real conversation, the behind center distance stuff and the real attitude things is of course, very interesting. And as you said, we could do a couple hours on this, and I've talked about it as a researcher for a really long time, and I'm not always sure people understood it. I know it got their attention when, basal rod anthracnose started to be a problem when you had too aggressive of an angle of attack. But let's talk about something that's been commonplace for a while since electrical reels have come to the market, but I don't hear people talking about it. What is your perception, Trent, of the importance of frequency of clip? Let's start with greens versus fairways and tee height. Is frequency of clip more or less valuable, that it has to be equal? Is that one of those things we were taught that's wrong, that height of cut should equal frequency of clip? Talk to me a little bit about your thinking about frequency of clip when you approach this topic.
I think matching frequency of clip to the height of cut, within 10% is a fair statement until you get below 125. Once you get below 125, I don't think it matters. And
Okay.
I mean, the other thing, there's no manufacturer making a setup where you can spin a reel blade fast enough to get your or your clip down to 0.85, or whatever.
Well, yeah,
They
yeah,
don't go that
yeah.
low.
That's right. But at the higher heights of cut, like fairways, you think it is important.
I think it's really important, and I think it's more important on cool season grasses because they tend to be a little limper, if you will, and they blow around more than a lot of the warm seasons do. So I think it's really important on those. And I've seen guys just talking recently about, you know, somebody was using a 14 bladed reel mowing tees at 750, and that just don't work because that leaf blade is getting hit 4,200 times a second, you know, before it gets cut. I don't know. It's just
Yeah.
too much. So I think it
So,
is important.
yeah. And that's one of those things that I wonder if you'd classify that in something that we don't really understand very well. Or, yeah, obviously people do those things. The assumption is more is better, right? More blades. I remember when I talked to a engineer at Toro that will remain nameless, or an engineer at Jake. Somebody had a 8 blade or 10 bladed reel, and so then the next company said, well, we'll just make 11 bladed reel because it's more, and people think it's better. Now listen, as we start to wrap up our conversation for today, I really appreciate you taking the time, but I don't get to talk to people very often who have their own podcast. And I can tell you, I have two things going on when I'm doing my podcast, and I want to sort of hear about it from you. Uh, One is I have my own ideas about sort of the vision for the industry and the things I like to talk about, and I like to use it as a way to promote that. But I also use it as a way to learn a ton of stuff. I have learned an enormous amount from the 200 episodes and 10 years of doing this thing. I can't tell you the amount of stuff I've learned. I probably couldn't even write it down. But after 100 episodes of doing real turf tech stuff, can you give me let's see if we can do a top three things that have been most valuable to you in doing the podcast, whether it's things you learned or people coming up to you and saying, man, I really like listening to you. I personally get that a fair amount. I get people that give me some stupid looks, which means I know they think I'm a jerk, which I can live with as well. What are let's start with maybe three things that doing the podcast has either taught you or feel like you've been really effective in promoting.
Just a few things. So I had a listener. I met him in the Carolinas at their show, and he came up to me and he said, "Your podcast has changed my life."
Oh, so great.
And I had no idea starting this, that I would hear that. And where he was coming from, he says, "Before I heard your podcast, I thought I was all alone." And ends up, there's a bunch of other people just like me out there. A single person in the shop doing their thing, grinding, grinding, grinding. So that was awesome. We've also had people reach out on mental health stuff. I did a few mental health episodes, and they were not the most popular episodes, but I don't care because that's helping people, right? I'm not out here to get views or downloads or any of that thing. I'm here because I like helping, and a lot of golf course mechanics, technicians, whatever you want to call us. We like helping other people. And the main reason I started this podcast, or I mean, the only reason, is podcast was becoming more popular. And I thought nobody has a podcast for technicians. And I even approached a few people that were already doing a podcast. Say, hey, you should do one for technicians. And they say, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. And then nothing ever happened. So I just picked the ball up and run with it. So here we are.
Yeah. So listen, and I got to tell you, I couldn't agree more. The equipment managers, much like superintendents, I think in a more quiet way, you're in the back room of the back of the house shop, right? I mean, when you think about superintendents as back of the house, like you think about a chef, as back of the house, right? And maybe the clubhouse manager or the maitre d' or the golf pro as front of the house. The equipment managers are in the back of the house usually, and often, as you said, work very solitary, right? I hadn't thought about that until you've been mentioning it recently, and I'm wondering if that isn't something that all crews could do a better job of sometimes, is including the equipment manager as part of the team, not somebody, there's somebody that's there at the morning meeting, right? Or somebody that has their thing on the task tracker so it's clear what they're working on, right? Because I would imagine after being there a long time, on certain days I'm doing PM on this, and this, and if nothing breaks, I'm doing PM on this, and this. And so you also have a routine. I wonder if staff and superintendents and assistants could do a better job including equipment managers as part of the team, even though maybe many of them do. I'm wondering if you see that as something we could do better.
I would think so, but I don't want to put it all on them. And I encourage people listening to my podcast all the time, is get involved. Start talking to people, whether it's your crew or whoever. So I think the technicians or equipment managers, it's like the phone call. It works both ways, right? I can call you, you can call me. So however you want to do it to get the job done, go for it.
So in meeting a lot of equipment managers, obviously, chatting with them on your podcast, they're not having any problem communicating. But I think a lot of them, especially when they're young, really suffer that little bit of lack of confidence, right? They're in the shop, they're not making decisions necessarily on the course. But I think, like you said, many superintendents have given them a choice. They're going to say, I can't do what the equipment manager does. I can do what the assistant does. I can't do what that person does. Sometimes it's hard for personality types to break out. I'm hoping your podcast is helping those folks. I'm sure you do too.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I had a guy the other day sent me a message, and he was doing some local education at an equipment manager's get together in his area. And he said it was being on my podcast that broke him out of his shell. So, it's just little steps like that, getting out of your comfort zone.
It's so great.
And I preach get out of your comfort zone all the time, because that's why I'm sitting here today, because I got out of my comfort zone one time, 7 years ago, and here I am. Hadn't been able to shut me up since.
Well, okay. Well, since I got you out of your comfort zone, and we're going to get you out of here on this, I've been on a little bit of a rant mood lately about the lack of effective competition for the current metal equipment distributors, manufacturers in turf. We have essentially, for all intents and purposes, two colors left. And I'm really worried that that's stifling innovation, that they're not pushing each other. I wouldn't say I'm that impressed with technology that either of them are bringing to the table at the show. I see a chainsaw company from Sweden bringing more innovation into our industry than our own company's been selling us metal for years. I look at a fairway mower today, Trent. It looks almost the same as it did 20, 30 years ago, except maybe for a little more technology and some diesel, emission stuff. Do you share my concern that the lack of competition among equipment manufacturers in our industry is maybe holding us back a little bit?
100% agree with
Oh,
you
I'm
on that.
so glad.
Yes, yeah.
I'm
I
so
mean,
glad.
and this is something. I mean, I could get on my soapbox real
Well,
quick.
you can because I'm ready to go. So I'll let you have the soapbox and then we'll get out of here. Tell me your opinion on this.
All right, this is all opinion, and
Oh,
you
yeah,
know what
yeah.
they
Well,
say about
we've lost
opinions,
everybody.
right?
Nobody's listening anymore. They left us after the attitude of the bed knife.
They dipped out after behind center distance, but yeah, two manufacturers. When one has a price increase, the other has a price increase.
It's incredible,
Equipment
isn't it?
has increased 50% in the last 3 years, and everybody blames it on COVID. Well, the cost of a car has increased, but it has not doubled in the last 3 or 4 years. And the other thing that really gets under my skin is with both of these distributors, you have so if you wanted to buy a Ford truck, you can go
Mhm.
anywhere in the country and buy a Ford truck. If I want to buy a piece of turf equipment, I have to buy it from this dealer. Or if it's coming from this company, I got to buy it from this dealer. And same thing with parts. If you want parts, you have to order it from this dealer. They're the only ones in the world that can sell you this part. And what does that do to parts? They go through the roof.
So this is even a deeper concern. I hadn't thought about the parts thing, but for sure, I was just worried. When we started our work, Jacobson really made great mowers. I mean, 20 years ago, when we first started testing the battery operated Eclipse, the hand unit, as they started to perfect it. Now they didn't get the motor right when they released it, but they were working on it. I mean, Jake was a competent company. They still had a lot of people based in Wisconsin. They hadn't moved the whole operation to Charlotte yet. And then over time, they just fell off the map. And I think in the last 15 years, we've just seen both the consolidation that you've talked about. And I just worry things just don't look like they're improving. Never mind, they're costing more. You're exactly right. I mean, we have a sponsor to this program, Frost Spray Technologies, and I love Ken Ross. And he told me he can get me a sprayer in 65 to 70 days.
Huh.
I talked to somebody with a color of metal, and they're telling me I'm lucky for 2 years to
Exactly.
be able to get something. So, I think the lack of competition is allowing these people to basically dictate their own terms, since you and I have both decided to sabotage our career right here
Right,
on the
right.
podcast.
No more sponsors for us, but
No more. Well, not of those colors, but I'm wondering, when you talk to people about this, is this one of those things that's just not talked about, except in two knuckleheads like us get on a podcast that nobody listens to? Or do you see it really impacting people in ways that we should start speaking up about?
I mean, it's going to kill the mom and pop courses, I think. The
Mm.
price of equipment. They're not going to be able to afford new equipment, and then that drives the price of used equipment up, and they're not going to be able to afford that either. So you're going to see a lot of mom and pops going out of business, I think, just because they can't afford turf equipment.
Or they're going to have really good equipment managers to keep things that are 35 years old running.
Yeah, true. That might be too. But yeah, they'll go broke paying us to keep their
That's
old
right.
stuff running.
Well, let me take a minute and thank you one more time, Trent. Really appreciate you taking the time and talking to a knucklehead like of the many knuckleheads you have to deal with who don't work in the equipment area. Really appreciate you being patient and giving me some really solid answers. I would really, recommend listening to your podcast. I listened to the one you did with Chris Hyman, one of our own equipment managers here in New York,
Okay,
who
yeah.
I know is well regarded. So I just want to thank you for taking the time and really wish you the best with the podcast, your endeavors to sort of raise the professionalism of this industry. And I'm sure you're going to get a lot more positive comments about your podcast moving forward. It really is well done. Trent, thank you very much for taking the time to join me. Really appreciate all the work that you do to support equipment managers. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from the Real Turf Tech podcast coming forward. Appreciate you taking the time to join me.
Thank you so much, Frank, for having me on. That was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for listening to the Real Turf Techs podcast. I hope you learned something today. Don't forget to subscribe. If you have any topics you would like to discuss or you'd like to be a guest, find us on Twitter at Real Turf Techs. See you bye.